Hello, dear Manhwa fans. I hope you're all having a fantastic day. Before we begin, I'd love to get some Manhwa recommendations for an upcoming vote. Also, a huge shout out to everyone who left comments on the last video. A special mention goes to Essay Guts 3, who posted the first comment, our fastest follower. Thank you so much. Now, without further delay, let's dive into this incredible summary. As Ira waited, Teo was visibly nervous, his face burning red with embarrassment. It was then that Era remarked that, now that she thought about it, she realized she didn't really know anything about him. Even though he had been by her side for so long, she wondered if he had been hiding something from her. Teo felt even more flustered, and Era, gripping the chalice with a more serious expression, voiced her curiosity about who he really was. Trying to dodge the question, Teo stepped away for a moment and began preparing everything for a mass. Growing impatient, Era asked why the chalice was glowing so brightly. Teo hesitated before explaining that the glow came from her, as she was the one looking at it. However, Era stood up and proceeded to clean the chalice. To Teo, her gesture didn't seem as simple as it appeared, and her expression showed concern. He cursed himself internally, but as he watched Era clean the chalice, something in him shifted. He reflected that seeing her do so gave him an odd sense of peace. As Ira continued cleaning, she asked him to tell her more about himself. Teo, however, asked her to stop, feeling that she was pushing too far. This irritated Ira, who raised her voice and asked if he had just given her an order. She gripped the chalice more firmly, leaving Teo terrified. Ira, however, pressed him with one more question. If he answered honestly, she would let him go. She demanded to know who he really was and who his parents were. Teo, visibly embarrassed, couldn't hide his discomfort. But Era, still chewing on some gummy buttons she had taken from him, continued pressing. This finally led Teo to speak. He admitted that he was an orphan raised by the church, and his last name had become Gospel. As Ira ate and held the chalice, she recalled that Gospel was one of the surnames given by the Church of Light to orphans and bastards. So, she asked Teo how he had ended up sold as a slave to Elga. Teo, looking somewhat defeated and still blushing, explained that all he could remember was that it had happened in the blink of an eye. Intrigued, Era wanted to know if he had any memories before becoming a slave. Teo confirmed that he didn't, as he couldn't lie to Her Majesty. Era studied Teo thoughtfully. Although she seemed puzzled, she could tell he wasn't lying. This left Teo a bit uneasy, but after a moment of contemplation, Era had an idea. Since she noticed that he had spoken truthfully, she decided to reward him. Teo was a bit skeptical, but Era, after washing her hands with holy water, told him she could help him pray for a while. Of course, Teo wasn't entirely convinced by the idea, but when he saw Era start to get annoyed, he had no choice but to comply. She seemed quite amused by the situation, especially as she teased Teo, who behaved like a little puppy always following commands. Teo cursed himself internally, though at the same time, he felt a strange sense of calm while obeying Ira. At that moment, Era told him that if he ever went to get more holy water, he should let her know, as she knew that men could sense when the chalice began to release it. Teo, of course, had no objections, and agreed. As he read a passage from the Bible, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had become nothing more than a mere plaything. Despite everything, he knew that Era was purifying his soul, and deep down, what he desired most was to have a real mass with her. At one point, he felt the need to retrieve the holy water, so he informed Era that he would have to pause his reading to go get it. Though she noticed the seriousness in his voice, Era simply smiled and denied him permission, insisting that she wanted him to continue reading. Teo, growing uneasy, tried once more to explain that he had to go, but Era refused again, warning him that if he disobeyed, she would punish him. Left with no choice, Teo continued reading, though at an increasingly hurried pace, knowing that sooner or later the chalice would begin to overflow with holy water. Then suddenly, Teo stumbled, spilling the water all over Era. Despite the situation, Ira didn't seem upset, though Teo was deeply worried. Intrigued, Era asked if this water was truly meant to purify a woman's heart, as it wasn't what she had expected. Feeling the weight of his mistake, Teo dropped to his knees before her, convinced that he deserved punishment for his error. To Era, however, it wasn't a big deal. Given the nature of their relationship, nothing could be considered that severe of a punishment. In fact, what she liked most about the situation was the scent of the water, which reminded her of flowers and brought her a sense of calm. Seeing that Ira wasn't reacting with her usual cold and distant demeanor, Teo began to think this might be his chance to speak about what was on his mind. Era, noticing that he seemed lost in thought, asked if he had something to say. Teo hesitated, realizing that Era was quick to pick up on his thoughts, so he needed to consider all external risks before speaking. He knew that if she hadn't been angered by the spilled holy water, it meant she was in a generous mood. With a deep sigh, Teo knelt once more and solemnly asked Ira to listen to his humble request. This confused Ira, who didn't understand why he was speaking so seriously. Wanting to know what was going on, she invited him to speak. Teo, with some hesitation, admitted that he wanted to resign as the court gardener. Because of this confession, Teo was imprisoned in the castle dungeons. Feeling dejected, he cursed himself for having ended up in such a predicament, despite having waited for the right moment to speak. While reflecting on his situation, he suddenly heard a laugh echoing in the distance. A mocking voice asked what he had done to end up there. Turning around, Teo recognized Elga, who had also been brought to the dungeons. Elga told him that she had heard Ira was furious with him, and upon going to see her, had confirmed it. This greatly amused Elga. Embarrassed, Teo also noticed that she was holding a Danonino, which made him blush even more. With a serious tone, he asked her to stop teasing him and to help him get out of there. However, Elga insisted on knowing what he had done to end up in this situation. Teo recalled how Era had become deeply angry after hearing his request. She had demanded an explanation as to why he wanted to resign, but Teo wasn't sure she would believe his true reasoning, so he had remained silent. Seeing his refusal to speak, Era, visibly hurt, had ordered him to leave, stating that she didn't want to see him at that moment. As a result, Teo was punished with expulsion from the castle. In the present, Teo understood that while they called it a punishment, it was really just a way of telling him to clear his mind at the Lioness household before returning. As he and Elga traveled by carriage, he appeared deep in thought. Noticing his demeanor, Elga asked if he wasn't going to tell her the real reason Era had exiled him. She had heard rumors that it all started because of a disrespectful act toward the royal family and wanted to know exactly what he had said to Era. Teo, slightly irritated, asked if she truly wanted to know, and Elga, her curiosity piqued, nodded. Teo then confessed that all he had done was asked to resign as the court gardener. Elga, somewhat incredulous, couldn't understand how such a simple request had led to his imprisonment and exile. She felt there had to be more to the story. With an ironic smile, she jokingly asked if it had been some kind of lover's quarrel. Teo, for his part, knew that he had other reasons for returning to the Lyonnaise estate, but he couldn't reveal them just yet. Still, growing frustrated, he asked Elga to stop making fun of him. He already had enough problems to deal with. It was then that Elga realized this would be her way of handling the situation for now. As a representative of the Lyonnaise family, she was going to punish him appropriately for not having shown proper respect to the royal family. This made Teo question whether he truly needed more punishment, but Elga saw things differently. Era had already imposed her own punishment, and now it was her turn to deliver one on behalf of her family. She instructed him to close his eyes. Teo, though now more thoughtful, obeyed, already anticipating the obvious. Elga would give him another kiss, and he would be so embarrassed that she would end up laughing at him again. In the end, she would be the only one enjoying the situation. However, when he felt her drawing closer, he instinctively wanted to know what she was doing. Calmly, she reassured him that she was simply carrying out his punishment, one that would be special for his failure to properly take care of Ira. Though Teo was visibly blushing, Elga pulled out a chalice and told him not to worry. The carriage they were traveling in was exclusive to her family, meaning that whatever happened inside would remain between the two of them. With a smirk, she began polishing the chalice, which gleamed under her touch. As she did, she thought about how, despite Teo now serving Ira, the chalice had originally belonged to him. Meanwhile, Teo was deep in thought. He recalled how, in the past, he used to feel embarrassed whenever Elga made him touch the pastries she always carried. Yet now, he couldn't understand why she was helping him with the chalice. He assumed she might be trying to win him over in some way. Nevertheless, he helped her clean the chalice more thoroughly, which took Elga by surprise. Afterward, she asked what he was trying to accomplish with this behavior, to which Teo simply reminded her that she had said everything happening in that carriage would stay between them. More than anything, he was focused on making sure she didn't hide the beautiful pastries she had with her. This flustered Elga even more, and once again, she demanded to know what exactly he was doing. With a hint of mischief, Teo asked if there was anything wrong, knowing full well that she was the one who had started all of this. However, Elga pushed him back slightly, telling him that this was precisely the kind of reaction she had expected from him, especially since there was something strange in his gaze. In his mind, Teo felt that Elga was exaggerating. He knew she was a high-ranking noble, while he was just a former servant. He wondered if every action within this carriage was permissible simply because she allowed it. With that, Teo began eating one of the pastries, focusing on the gummy filling inside. This made Elga blush, momentarily speechless. Noticing her reaction, Teo immediately paused and asked if she wanted him to stop. Completely flustered, Elga shook her head and allowed him to continue, at least for now. Teo accepted her decision, but not without first pulling her into an embrace. In that moment, Elga asked if he still belonged to her. Teo nodded, affirming that although he was currently bound to the palace, his orders still came from her. He believed that both Ira and Elga expected these kinds of situations from him. Even if they had their suspicions, it felt like they were calling it a necessity. Because of that, he was determined to make sure Elga thought of nothing but him. Despite having told him not to eat the danonino, Teo knew she wasn't being honest. The treat was completely cold and already melting. He thought it would be endearing if Elga were more truthful with him, so he continued eating his danonino, determined to grow big and strong, something that seemed to catch Elga off guard. She found it strange to see Teo behaving this way, but he was set on ignoring her reaction. Finally, after a while, Elga asked him to stop eating and urged him to help her purify her soul. Seeing the impatience on her face, Teo knew he had accomplished his goal. He had been waiting for this moment, as her expression now showed a genuine request for guidance. Teo agreed to help her and prepared everything for a small mass inside the carriage. As he began reading the first passage, Elga sat there, visibly blushing, waiting for him to help her find the path to God. For Elga, the sensation was unfamiliar. The more Teo read, the more she felt that her soul, tainted by so many emotions and uncertainties, was gradually being purified. It was something entirely new to her, something she had never experienced before. However, upon noticing Teo's concern for her, she showed him a picture of a puppy to help him relax a little. Sensing her discomfort, Teo casually remarked that he needed to fetch more holy water. Elga allowed him to do as he wished, and Teo used the water to further cleanse his soul. After that, both of them found themselves somewhat flustered by the situation. Still, Elga asked Teo to stay with her a little longer. With a soft smile, Teo leaned in and gave her a gentle kiss, causing Elga's cheeks to flush even more. Embarrassed, she asked in a timid voice if they would be having another mass. However, Teo didn't seem entirely pleased with the request. Instead, he leaned closer and whispered in her ear that the carriage was about to stop, and that although they had yet to find the path to the Lord, they would have plenty of time for it in the future. Feeling reassured, Elga agreed with his words. Upon arriving at her home, the family's servants were already waiting outside. The moment Elga stepped out of the carriage, they greeted her warmly. However, she quickly walked past them, barely paying attention to their words, excusing herself by saying she felt tired and would head straight to her room. The butler, observing from the entrance, glanced at the carriage, remembering that Teo was still inside. With a polite smile, Teo greeted him. It had been a while since they had last seen each other. The butler, in a friendly tone, reminded him that it had been 3 years since their last meeting and offered to guide him to the guest quarters. Before Teo could follow, the butler informed him that the master wished to see him first, meaning he had to pay his respects before anything else. In his mind, Teo knew the moment had arrived. Meanwhile, the master was in the midst of an intense mass with one of his attendants, purifying her soul. He read from the scriptures tirelessly until the butler suddenly announced Teo's arrival. Finishing the ceremony, the master used holy water to complete the purification process. The attendant, visibly drained from the ritual, swiftly left the room without a word. Teo watched her hurry away, finding it somewhat interesting, though he chose not to comment on it. When he finally entered the chamber, the master greeted him with a stern nod. Teo, showing proper respect, returned the gesture to Duke Reinhard, head of the Lyonnaise and Barza families and a distinguished member of the Red Banner Knights. However, before Teo could say anything, the Duke motioned for him to approach and take a seat. After a brief silence, Reinhard directly asked him what he was plotting, catching Teo slightly off guard. Teo assured him that he was merely there on vacation, but the Duke remained unconvinced. Sensing this, Teo decided to provide more details. With a slight smirk, he explained that Duke Reinhard, also known as the Master, had been relieved of his duties as royal inspector by order of Queen Ira. This revelation immediately enraged Reinhard, who couldn't comprehend why he'd been dismissed, especially since Ira, despite being queen, lacked the authority to make such a decision without just cause. Frustrated, the Duke insulted Teo, calling him a stray dog daring to challenge his authority in his own home. He then questioned him again, asking if he truly had the audacity to defy his power. Feeling the weight of the Duke's intimidation, Teo took a deep breath before continuing. Calmly, he informed him that he had now been appointed as the new prime minister, replacing Sir Fargus as head of the palace cabinet. The news left the Duke utterly stunned. Suspicious, he began to wonder what Teo was truly planning. When he demanded an answer, Teo, maintaining his composure, admitted that both he and the Queen intended to leave the palace soon. At this, the Duke asked who, besides himself and the Draco family, could possibly protect the palace in their absence. At that moment, Reinhard struck a nearby piece of furniture forcefully, interrupting Teo. The mere mention of Draco and his allies had clearly unsettled him. Deep down, Teo knew that Reinhard was a man who craved power and recognition. In a way, that made him the best choice to safeguard the palace while he and the Queen were away. The Duke, now calmer, asked Teo why the Queen was leaving the palace. Teo, with a serious expression, replied that he could not reveal it yet, as Ira had not given him permission to do so. However, since he was about to assume the position of Prime Minister, he was willing to share the details when the time was right. In his mind, Teo was certain that the first phase of his plan was already in motion. He explained that Queen Era would be enrolling in a nearby academy, a revelation that greatly surprised the Duke. Reinhard let out a laugh, refusing to believe that Ira would truly attend an academy. Teo, remaining silent, stood firm against Reinhard's skepticism. The Duke, knowing that Teo was not someone easily deceived, pressed further. He asked if Teo truly believed that Era would allow herself to be taught by someone else. Once again, Teo did not respond immediately, aware that the Duke was testing his honesty. Reinhard went on, emphasizing how difficult it would be for anyone to educate Era, who embodied the very force of nature itself. No one who dared to stand in her way would emerge unscathed. Despite the Duke's doubts, Teo confidently stated that Ira would indeed allow herself to be taught, as his heart still beat with certainty that the Queen was willing to change. Still unconvinced, the Duke questioned Teo further about his intentions. However, Teo, unwavering, explained that he was not hiding anything. He was merely a humble servant, ready to be the voice of his queen. A seasoned warrior with a sharp mind, Reinhard began to consider the unpredictability of the Queen. Her desire for control made him suspicious of Teo's plans. Despite his reservations, he ultimately accepted the idea of Teo becoming prime minister, knowing he could not allow the Draco family to seize power. In the end, he advised Teo to rest well before his departure, as he needed to be fully prepared for what lay ahead. With a slight bow, Teo expressed his gratitude to the Duke and left the chamber. Reinhard watched him go with a steady gaze, fully aware that the pieces of the game had begun to move.